Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who is joining us today for this wonderful joint program that we are holding together with the CBA, Center for Ballet and the Arts. My name is Claire Fitzgerald. I am the Associate Director and Gallery Curator at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. And we've had a really wonderful opportunity to present this program, which is really, we were just talking before we came on about what sort of wonderful overlapping coincidences we've found among us all, sort of based around the idea of humors. So this, we at ISAW are very good friends, and happily so, with the Center for Ballet and the Arts, also at NYU. And when we were working on our new digital exhibition, that called The Empire's Physician, Prosperity, Plague, and Healing in Ancient Rome, which traces the biography of the physician Galen and also looks at the broader medical landscape in the ancient Mediterranean. We were really also thinking at the same time about reception, the influence of the ideas of Galen and other ancient thinkers, and also about how those ideas sort of ripple into our contemporary world. And so I'm very happy to introduce our three panelists today. Each of them have very long and very impressive CVs. So I'm just going to give you a tiny taste of each. First, we welcome Jennifer Homans from the founder of the Center for Ballet and the Arts. And she is the author of, among others, Apollo's Angels, A History of Ballet, which was named one of the 10 best books of the year in the New York Times and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And again, many other accolades. I also would like to welcome Brooke Holmes, who teaches in the classics department at Princeton University. She is the author of The Symposium in the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece, which was also published in 2010, as well as Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. She is the co-editor of many, many books. Most recently, Antiquities Beyond Humanism, which was just published in 2019. And she'll talk also about a project she was involved in with our next panelist, who is Martha Friedman. She is a sculptor living and working in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. She is a senior lecturer and the director of the visual arts program at Princeton University. Her work has been featured in numerous national and international solo and group shows, and has ongoing collaborations with the choreographer and dancer Silas Riener, as well as the Susan Marshall Dance Company. So we're very happy to have these three scholars and artists with us today. And I'm just going to briefly go over some housekeeping about our program today. So, in case you didn't hear the announcement at the beginning, just a moment ago, this lecture is being recorded and will eventually be posted by the CBA and on ISAW's website. We ask that no one in the audience make their own recording of today's lecture. We are providing live captioning during the event. This is available by clicking on the closed captioning or CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you would like to access this and are having trouble, you can receive help through the Q&A button. And someone will sort of help you figure out what's going on technically. The Q&A feature on Zoom is also how we will be managing the questions for the speakers. So selected questions will be answered after the presentation, and we've set aside some time for that. So if you are thinking as you go and you say, "Oh, I don't want to forget that question," you can just type it in, and we'll go through it at the end. And we are so excited. We're so excited to begin. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Homans to tell you a little bit more about the Center for Ballet and the Arts. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Ballet and the Arts, as you now know, and when Claire called me to possibly collaborate on this event, it seemed like just the perfect thing for us, because it's an event that has to do with ideas, but also with the body and dance and movement, which is the sort of focus of the center. If you want to find out more about the center, my colleague Courtney will put the link to our website in the chat, and you can find out there a lot about what we do. But when I heard about the Galen exhibition, I immediately thought of Brooke Holmes, because I knew her work from my own research on Balanchine's Four Temperaments. And so I called her, and then she said, well, but wait, I've been doing an exhibition on the humors with Martha Friedman. And so there we were, suddenly the three of us. And so now this is what you're getting. I'm just going to give you a brief sort of run of show so that you know what you're in for. It's going to be a kind of three-part thing. And the first is going to be Brooke and I in conversation, largely about the humors and some, and her area of expertise in the humors. Then she'll talk with me about Balanchine and his 1946 ballet, The Four Temperaments. And then we will bring in Martha to talk with us both and to present her 2015 exhibition, Pore, which is also about, you'll see, the humors in one way or another. So the idea is to sort of span the humors from the origin of the idea to a contemporary reflection on them. So with that, why don't we just begin, Brooke, you and I, how about that? And let me just ask you so that we can all sort of get some idea of, who was Galen and what are the humors and where did it all start?
Thank you, Jennifer. It's such a pleasure to be here, and want to thank you and Claire for inviting me. And it does seem like a very sort of fortuitous meeting of ideas. So, I think I'll start just talking a little bit about the humors, both situated historically, but also as a kind of set of ideas and problems. The humors and the idea that there are these constituent stuffs within a human being first starts to sort of appear in Greek texts, in pre-Socratic texts of the 6th century, 5th century. We have a fragment from someone called Alcmaeon of Croton where he talks about different stuffs within a human being that together may be balanced into health. And he's probably in conversation with older learned medical traditions in the Mediterranean, Egyptian and Babylonian. But really the best evidence we have for the emergence of humoral theory are the 60 odd texts in the Hippocratic Corpus. And so there we start to see the idea, again, as one author talks about it, the author of On Ancient Medicine sort of describes the beginnings of medicine as that people realize that there are these stuffs within us, these fluid stuffs that are responsible for human nature, but are also responsible for making us sick. And these stuffs are very much in dialogue with or responsive to other elements within the environment. And so they change in response to seasons, they change in response to food and drink, which is what the author of On Ancient Medicine is particularly interested in. But other authors are more interested in how different humors in the bodies might shift according to the season, according to changes of weather, because they share certain elemental qualities. Hot, cold, wet, and dry are some of the major sort of common denominators. So you get the idea that there are these things within us. And I'm saying things because the bulk of our texts believe there's more than one humor, but they don't all agree on what those are. And in fact, the four humor theory that's going to become so important in the later tradition it only really appears in its canonical form in one text called On the Nature of a Human Being, where you get yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. But in these texts, there's just, some of them have two, some of them have an uncountable number. And they're constantly changing and they're interacting with one another. And if one of them becomes dominant, or if somehow the mixture of them goes off, we become sick. So the humors as kind of fluid substratum of the self, they're very changeable. And that changeability is a site for pathology. That's why we get sick, but that's also the opening for medicine, because medicine and therapeutics can then intervene and influence through diet and exercise and drugs, which are kind of continue with food, influence that mixture within a human being. There's a great bit I like in a text called On Regimen, where he says, trees can adapt to the seasons, but humans have to do it with their mind. And so they do it through regimen and medicine. So there's a close relationship, I think, in the tradition between medicine as a techne, as an art, as a science that is the human capacity to intervene in the body, and the fluidity of the humors. So that's really the kind of backdrop that we're looking at when we think about humoralism.
Okay, so there are these there are humors inside us, and then they can get off balance. Is that right?
Yeah, there can be too much of one, too little of one. One can start to, if you have too much phlegm, it can start to attract, more of itself to itself in certain points in the body. So there are different nosological models, but basically the emphasis is really on fluids and instability and changeability within that. And that's why you need medicine.
Okay, so then we get to sort of Hippocrates. Who is he, and what's his relationship to Galen?
Yeah, so maybe this is a good moment. I have a slide just so people who aren't familiar with the kind of historical backdrop don't have to try to hold on to dates and names while I sort of go over this. So Hippocrates as a historical figure is usually dated to about 460 to 375. Then we have this corpus of texts which are ascribed to him, but we really don't know if he wrote any of these. And so I won't get into that. We usually talk about them as the Hippocratic Corpus, about 60 texts. What's clear from the corpus is they're written by different authors, different genres. As I said, they have different theories. And in the Hellenistic period, so in the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BCE, in Alexandria, now we're in after Alexander the Great, you have the Ptolemaic kingdom in Alexandria. And you start to see the gathering of texts and editing of texts that are ascribed to Hippocrates. And it's really this process that constitutes the Hippocratic Corpus. And we start to see more attention being paid to these texts as sort of canonical, as important texts ascribed to this authority figure. And these texts continue to circulate and receive attention, and learned medicine as a tradition continues to develop. And I'm going to skip over a lot of that because we wanted to get to Galen. But Galen is part of a larger cultural moment in the 2nd century. So he's born in 129 and he dies early in the 3rd century, where there's a kind of revival of interest in Hippocrates and in Hippocrates texts. So maybe if we just go to the next slide, we can see something. I'm going to go relatively, this is just a kind of, if you haven't had a chance to look at the exhibition, I highly recommend it. You'll get more of a sense of the life of Galen and his sort of exceptional status as a physician and a philosopher. He had an enormous reputation as a doctor in his own lifetime. And then his texts really displace a lot of earlier medical writing because they become so canonical and influence learned medical theory derived from the Greek tradition for many centuries in numerous places. But let me just say something quickly about Galen and Hippocrates. Maybe, Andrea, if you could go to the next slide. One thing that we see is Galen is very interested in the texts of Hippocrates, and he writes commentaries on texts. And these texts are really treated as authoritative, almost, I think, Wesley Smith talks about them as almost kind of biblical texts. And so a lot of Galen's self-definition comes through his working through Hippocratic texts, where he's trying to make sense of his own theory by sort of projecting it back on Hippocrates, but also in dialogue with these earlier texts. So he's really interested in this text called On the Nature of a Human Being, but he also writes his own text called On Mixtures. So if we go to the next slide, you could just put all of the different parts on. This is a teaching slide. Galen has a kind of picture of medicine that isn't just humoral. He has a lot of different things going on, but he is committed to the idea of the 4 humors that he ascribes to Hippocrates. And he's committed to the idea that people have individual constitutions depending on which humor might predominate. And he's committed to the idea that humoral mixtures change based on seasons, climate, and what you eat. So for Galen too, there's that opening around the humors as a site for therapeutic intervention. Between Hippocrates and Galen, there's also been the rise of systematic dissection in Ptolemaic Alexandria. And so he has a very strong anatomical commitment to the body. which he thinks Hippocrates was responsible for, but there's been a lot that's happened between Hippocrates and Galen. And the other thing I just want to draw out, because it's important for his theory of mixture too, is he's very committed to Aristotelian ideas that the body is organized in such a way for it to flourish. And Galen is committed to the idea that there's a demiurgic God and who's made the body. And the one thing I want to just put on the table as we go in this opening section is that in the 4th century with Aristotle, but also a Hippocratic text, you get the idea that not only is there's this kind of fluid substratum, but there's this nature that organizes the body for the best. And Aristotle starts to develop the notion of parts and organs. But Galen also thinks that nature is kind of within the body organizing it. And so the doctor is trying to mimic nature. And if nature sort of goes awry, it's often because of the lability of the humors, the fluidity of humors. So nature is this kind of inner force now by the time you get to Galen, which is trying to organize the body for it to flourish. But things go awry because there's this fluid substratum and there are other things that go wrong, but that's a major one, and the doctor gets involved. So that notion of a nature in a body, but then also this changeability is sort of where you get into the as well as the idea of a humoral mixture, which is constantly changing.
So the temperaments, yeah, Balanchine's ballet is called after Hindemith's score, the four temperaments, and it does have 4 sections, the 4 humors, right? It has sanguinic, melancholic, phlegmatic, and what's the 4th?
Did you say choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic?
Yeah, there we go. Choleric. So the idea of the temperaments, is that the same thing really as the humors, or is this kind of is there a distinction?
Yeah, so they're related, but we see that the humoral theory emerged first. And already in the Hippocratic Corpus, you'll see the idea that certain people may have a certain humor that dominates, but it's only slightly tied to character traits. It's more tied to your predisposition to certain kinds of disease. There's a text that I want to just put on the table as I sort of wrap up the ancient stuff. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, and this is a text that's ascribed to Aristotle, even in antiquity. And it's part of a genre of text called physical problems. So a problem in Greek is really just an obstacle. A problem is an obstacle to thinking, and it's a challenge to questions that a doctor or a philosopher, natural philosopher might ask. And so the question that is what I put on the slide: why is it that all those men who've been extraordinary philosophers and poets and artists and politicians are obviously melancholic? And to the extent that they're seized by these illnesses that come from black bile. And so this text is really important to really starting to establish the idea that there is both a particular temperament that's exceptional, that's genius, but also can be a form of madness associated with black bile. But you can also see something going on in this text already between the melancholic temperament, which is by nature. So some people just are this way. And then there's a lot of discussion of how one can, have temporarily too much black bile if you drink too much. So wine is people get drunk and they talk a lot and they have crazy big ideas, or they get aggressive, or they get depressive. And so these are contingent ways in which a melancholic temperament might take over. So this text is really important because it's the first point in the ancient evidence we start to see this idea of character and humors. When you get to Galen, and I don't want to take too much time, so I do have a slide, you can put it up there, but I'm going to go pretty quick because this might not be interesting to people. But Galen has, in his treatise on the humors, he does start to develop the idea that there would be 4 different temperaments depending on which humor is prevailing. And he is ascribing certain physical and psychological characteristics. But really, the temperament theory of these 4 temperaments on equal weighting, but also the interest in melancholia, is more coming through first Avicenna, reception of Galen, And then in the kind of Latin West, the Middle Ages, you really start to see this idea of the four humors take off. It becomes mixed with astrological thinking, so tied to certain planets and influences. So it's really mostly a later phenomenon. But there's one more slide I'm going to throw out, and then I'm going to switch so we can talk about Balanchine. And this is the idea, if when you think about Galen, so you see the seeds of this temperament theory, and you still see this kind of interesting discussion of what is natural and fixed, what is natural and normative, and what is the role of the doctor in intervening. And so with the temperaments, you have this idea that there's 9 different ways to have a temperament or a mixture. And only one of them is good for Galen. Only one of them is sort of perfect. That's called aochresia. And there are 8 ways to go wrong based on a complicated theory he has of the relation between elements and humors. And so at a certain point, like the doctor can make some interventions, right? But if you have a certain humor predominating or a certain element, maybe you're too hot, right? Predominating, like that could be a kind of fixed condition that you can only sort of work around the edges because you're predisposed to certain conditions. But the reason I wanted to bring up this idea of kind of perfect mixture for Galen is that it's a very rare condition. And it's when all the different elements and humors are in perfect proportion. And he thinks that the kind of embodiment, visual representation of this is a statue from the 5th century, which is still very famous, by Polyclitus, called the Spear Bearer. And we know that Polyclitus, we know actually from Galen, who's our main source, wrote a text all about this statue embodying the perfect ratios in the body. So it becomes a real model for the classical body. And there's already in the 5th century probably a connection with medicine, but what we really can see with Galen is the way that he uses classical sculpture and the articulation of the classical body as the visual correlate to what he imagines the perfect humoral mixture would be. And I wanted to sort of end with this because I want to start asking you questions about this classical body and how it relates to the classical forms of ballet that Balanchine is working with, and how the humors within this tradition may have been interesting to him. So if we can, I would just love to ask you why Balanchine was interested in the 4 humors and how the ballet came about.
Okay, so I mean, this is so interesting because he's interested in Hindemith, first of all, but he's also interested in the humors, I think, because it's kind of an essential way of thinking about the body in the classical sense. So when you train a dancer to dance, it's basically you're sculpting the body, is how he would even talk about it. But it's the idea is that you can be the doctor, I guess, and make the external parts, at least, look like that statue. Right? Even if you or me or someone else who doesn't look like that normally, you can actually train them to look like that. You can intervene, you can make the body become that, which is not just a sort of arrangement of bones, it's also an arrangement of the insides through muscle. And so the idea of the 4 temperaments was in a way a natural one for him. And it's an interesting ballet in particular because it starts, he first works with Hindemith on it as the war is beginning, the Second World War. And then in New York, Hindemith, who was a German composer who fought in the trenches during World War I, was involved in Weimar culture and interested in expressionism, but also in a kind of more objective kind of music. He wrote a tremendous score, and we can't share the ballet with you online today, but there is going to be a link in the chat so that you can go watch it later if you'd like to. So, they get together and they start to work on this ballet. And the first way that they come to think of it is as a ballet called Cave of Sleep with designs by Chalichev. And Andrea, can you give me the first couple of images? The first and then the second. And his idea, Chalichev was very interested in the inner body, in this stuff that Brooke was talking about. This is the cave of sleep. And then the next slide, please. And here's a possible costume design that he came up with. So the idea was to kind of make the inner body the outside. Now, this did not end up going anywhere. Hindemith took one look at this and said, no, thank you, not for me. And so then they brought in Kurt Seligman, who's another sort of more surrealist designer. And you can give me the next slide, Andrea. And he came up with these costumes, which were the costumes for the original production. And the problem with them was that you can't move in them. So, you know, they're just, this is heavy suede and there's all kinds of baubles, and this is just one costume. They were all as elaborate as this. And Balanchine this time took one look at them, and, you know, on the one of the final rehearsals, just came up on stage with a huge pair of scissors and started cutting them away. So that finally what you get is next slide, you get a more, in 1951, he took those costumes away altogether and put the whole ballet into practice clothes. Mm. So a much more, so again, you're sort of moving from more to less, almost a nude towards your statue in a way, and towards revealing something of the inside without a costume, but doing it instead in dance.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about how, I mean, it is really interesting how the visual pressure shifts from the costume to the dance itself and the movements, like how Balanchine imagined what it would look like to see that, but also you've performed the ballet, and it would be so interesting to hear you talk about what it felt like to perform it as a kind of meditation on these insides, these fluid insides.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a really, I mean, it's a tremendous piece of work, and you have to realize, remember also that in 1946, I mean, I danced it in the 80s, and already then it was quite established, but back then it must have felt really, really strange. And you can see even in this picture, the man in the corner who represents melancholic. The women are kind of the support, but it is all doubled over in a kind of, and there are movements in this dance. It's almost like a clinical dissection of the body. It sort of takes the body parts, it takes the classical form, and takes it apart and makes it into, like, for example, there's a section where, you know, a woman is on point, and so her leg should be straight and tall. Instead, he bends it, he breaks it, he makes her crunch her foot into the floor and the toe shoe, and then the man takes her and like turns her like he's corkscrewing her into the floor. So it's almost a kind of like the body is broken and made into parts and mechanics. And then on the other hand, at moments, it just completely dissolves. Mm. So you feel this kind of sense that all that training is just kind of like flowing out of you, like the bones are disappearing, and there's a more fluid, to use your word, you know, a more fluid feeling in the movement itself, which I think was very hard for dancers to do.
I mean, it's so interesting because it's like, if you think back to the Galen and imagining the sculpture is already, you know, a form of representing the outside, but, you know, it represents this very idealized form of perfect mixture, when in fact the kind of labile quality of the humors has been tamed by some, you know, notion of mathematical ratio, and has produced this hyper articulated body. And the Greeks are very interested in articulation as the way you think about agency, control, the things that liquidity can undermine. And when Balanchine is coming in, it's like, to make the humors visible, he's not just thinking about fluidity represented, but it's circuited through another model of how to visualize, you know, the perfect body, the classical body. And so was he interested in the humoral body as pathological vis-a-vis the classical body, or more naturalistic? Where did that fit in terms of his understanding of norms?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing about Balanchine is he didn't say much, but what we can see from the choreography and from the structure of the dance is that, and I wonder what you think of this, Brooke, because what he did was he didn't give us a single, like, well mixed body, right? The way you were saying, we don't get that 1 out of 8. Instead, we get a depiction of each humor. And
Mm-hmm.
so that in a way, I mean, it seems to me anyway that these are depictions of a very sick body, because you're so heavy on one humor that you are like all black bile, or all, you know, you're overcome by this. And then, as you say, there's a kind of play between the force of that humor inside and the structural form, which is the classical technique, which is almost like the bony exterior. You could think of it as, you know, so that there's a kind of struggle going on, or at least a tension between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether that, I mean, was there ever a body that was all one humor, or are they generally mixed?
Yeah, I mean, there's Galen's sort of perfect body never quite comes back, but I think you point to something important, which is on the one hand, you have this ideal body, and mixture and fluidity is always a challenge to this male Greek articulated form. And then within humoral theory, and Galen's interested in this, you know, he'll say, you know, the body of a dog is, you know, is pathological in some way compared to the ideal human norm, but it's healthy in its own terms. So there's this pathology as norm built into a hierarchy of bodies within humoralism. You see it, femininity embodies a kind of liquidity. You see proto-racialism or racist theories, you know, in climate theory, where the Scythians have these liquid bodies that are their norms, but are deviant vis-a-vis this other norm. So I think that question of pathology and norm is already within, you know, humoral theory, entwined with notions of fluidity.
Right.
And I wonder if it would make sense should we bring Martha in at this point to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. There's Martha.
Hi. Wow, that was a lot and just super fascinating. And I'll just say thank you to everyone. And I'm really honored and excited to be part of this conversation. There's a lot of connections being made all over the place. So I thought I would just really quickly take over the screen and just sort of really quickly blast through a project that I did called Pore in 2015 that Jennifer mentioned that relates to all of this. And then we can talk about it. Okay. So some years ago, I'm an artist. I make a lot of sculpture out of rubber. And I make a lot of sculpture that's deals with casting and mold making, which is in itself a sort of logic of reversals. And became sort of obsessed with the material of rubber pretty early on. And I made a big rubber backdrop for a Merce Cunningham presentation at Princeton University that was sort of orchestrated or sort of put on by Silas Riener. And it's where I met Silas Riener, who has since become a really important collaborator in my work. And so they were hoping to borrow a Robert Rauschenberg, and it didn't quite work out with the Walker. And so at the last minute, they asked me if I would do something. And so I asked them if they would give me about 800 pounds of liquid rubber, and I'd be happy to pour that on the floor and see what happens. And so this is what happened. And then since then, I had been sort of dying to do it again in one way or another, is to make a rubber backdrop and to pour this viscous liquid on a floor and then hike it up, basically. And I was offered a project at a place called Locust Projects in Miami, and in 2015. And I had been really interested in the humors, but I got there just by, in sort of a dumb artist way. I just was really curious what colors are inside the body. If you just cut open a body and just took the Pantone swatch book and just looked at all the different colors that were in a kind of average body, what you would find. And that led me to learning about the four humors, which I immediately became fascinated with. And so I decided to build an exhibition around the four humors, where I would pour in total about 1,600 pounds of rubber on the floor in four colors. So you've got the red, the black bile, the yellow bile, and the phlegm. And that those sort of backdrops would extend out to kind of castings that would be costumes that would function both as sculptures foregrounding a backdrop, but also as costumes or skins for Silas to perform sort of 5 to 7 minute choreography, sort of dances that represented each of those humors. At some point early in this idea, Silas would come to the studio and we would talk about it, and I'd sort of drape him with rubber. And he said, well, you know about Balanchine, right? This is where it gets the timeline is a little interesting. And I said, well, yeah, I know about Balanchine. And he's like, well, you know about the 4 temperaments. And I'm like, I sort of know about the 4 temperaments. And then, you know, embarrassingly, I then went, I was like, oh, Balanchine has made this, and it's canonical and incredible. So at that point, Silas and I, as we sort of worked on this piece, we started to quote Balanchine's 4 temperaments, both in terms of we used some Hind myth music and sort of played with that. And then, you know, we sort of would quote different positions or movements or yeah, sort of some of the choreography we would cite in different ways. So this is Silas performing inside the sort of phlegmatic quadrant of the piece. This is the melancholic costume, which when not inhabited by Silas would be a sculpture. And so there are these sort of steel structures I created that I called the mannequins that would hold the costume when it wasn't being worn. So in the melancholic choreography, Silas would basically walk back and forth towards the black bile backdrop and then walk backwards until he hit a certain kind of equilibrium, in that his leg would lift up off the ground and he would arch backwards to try and play with the sort of balance, the physical balance between him, his leg, this piece of rubber, and this rubber backdrop. And we sort of thought about this in particular as him just doing one mini death scene after another, after another, after another, until he ran out of energy. This is the blood quadrant. And I can really quickly play just little excerpts of each one. I'll start in the upper left. And then phlegmatic to the right. And we were playing with the temperaments, or the sort of characteristics that we interpreted to go along with the humor. So with phlegmatic, he is like directionless, he's sort of spineless, he spends a lot of time on the floor. With the yellow bile, it was very proud. We thought about verticality. For blood, I made these like rubber shorts, sort of mimicking kind of a boxer in a boxing ring, and he wears the backdrop pretty directly as a sort of cape. And then again, here's the black bile that I just mentioned. And so I'm very interested in blurring the boundaries between what is a sculpture, what is a dance, what is skin, what is a sculpture, what is a costume. And so that was one of the big interests of mine in making this piece. These are images that we took in the studio while we were trying to figure out what he could move in. Rubber's extremely heavy, kind of going back to what you were saying, Jennifer, about the Balanchine. Rubber is very heavy. And so what I could ask him to do, get him to do, push him to do, had a lot to do with what he was physically capable of. And really pushing him to his limits. And my collaboration with him is a lot about pushing his body, this in some ways perfect classical male body, to its limits, and thinking about inverting it, thinking about disrupting it, thinking about upending even a power structure between a female sculptor and a male dancer. And so here is us in the studio. A lot of this had to be made in situ, and a lot of it had to be made in the studio. And so this was us thinking about how to play with this balance between the material stuff and his body. And you'll see that's a direct quote from the Balanchine piece, that sort of hip thrust.
And Martha, I don't know if you know, but this one, the other one, the back bend as well, is a direct quote from the melancholic section, where it's so interesting we talk about it as these little deaths, because the melancholic ends in a deep back bend like that, and the dancer walks backwards in the back bend off stage.
Right. Yes, yes.
So it's a similar kind of, it's very interesting to see.
You know, and that piece and all that choreography like lives inside Silas's body, you know, in really interesting and profound ways. And so trying to kind of, pull that out into the material world is really interesting. And there's just an image of pouring the rubber on the floor and kind of moving its fluidness around, you know, and that sort of relationship to fluidity and static reversals it was really important to me. So I'll stop sharing screen so we can talk.
I mean, I have a question for you right away. You know, just like, it's interesting to me that, you know, if you look at Balanchine's progress from, you know, more skin, as it were, to less on the skin or less skin, and yours towards, you know, bringing the insides out in a visible way. Yeah. And I just wonder how you think of what you were doing in terms of that classical body. And what, you know, like, is it a break with Balanchine? Is it a kind of continuity, or is that even not a smart way to think about it?
I was very, very interested, and still am in different ways, but in particular in Pore, P-O-R-E, the idea of inverting the body and that internal fluid part, in a sense, kind of becoming the context, becoming the skin, the costume, and the context within which the body exists. And so in some ways it's less about like piling stuff on top of a body, but invaginating the body, right? And like making the inside the outside, to hold it, to carry it. And I think that is interesting to me as a sort of push against, trying to get to your question, if I had to choose a team, it would be to push against a sort of notion that like usually the male human mind, brain is the center of the universe, that it's a bounded, you know, globed, central, you know, thinking part, the sort of Cartesian idea that because you're a smart man and you can think your thoughts, you exist, and not because you're in conversation with your context, you know, that I'm very interested in pushing against that, and that, you know, you are within your own container. So you are responding to the context. You know, you are a fluid that is one of the things about fluid or rubber or casting and mold making is that you pour a fluid into a shape, and then it sort of solidifies and takes the shape. So you take the shape of your container, your context, that you aren't a bounded brain. You are actually this sort of, you know, bag of fluids in some ways, that is more about responding to your context than inventing it, which is also why I called it Pore, P-O-R-E, that we're full of holes.
I want to ask a follow-up if there's, I mean, one thing that I find really fascinating is, and it goes back to this question of representation and maybe expression, but also the role of the choreographer, the sculptor, the doctor, which is, what does it mean to represent openness or fluidity, you know? And so there's this technique work that happens, which isn't the bounded brain, but is nevertheless creatively engaged with the production of a representation or the artistic representation of matter, or fluidity. And I'm curious, how that technique, I mean, Galen is interesting in his own ways about recuperating technique for the doctor versus the philosopher, but for you, I mean, how does that technique work, or for Balanchine too? I mean, the technique involved in making this visible and expressed.
You want to go, Martha? You want me to go first?
You go.
Okay, let's see if I can think about that. I mean, it's such a good question. I think, I mean, the doctor is not such, I wonder, it's not, maybe not such a bad analogy, because certainly it's an almost uncanny process, because there is a way in which the technique and the instruction is coming from Balanchine, right? He's telling them, try it this way, but actually he's also taking it from them. So, for example, I once was talking to somebody, actually it was to, anyway, it doesn't matter, but he said to me, yeah, I loved watching Balanchine work, because he would say, do this to the dancer, and the dancer would do something completely different, and he would say, that's right. So it would be, it's not like, okay, I've got an idea in my head and this is what it's going to be. It's kind of, I think he was really interested in, and this is something I was going to ask you, Brooke, and I would ask you too, Martha, is, it's sort of, for him, I think a very important part of it was life force, and kind of finding that in the body, waking the body up, as he always would put it. There's something asleep about it, and what could you do to do that? And so that's a little bit of a different project, Martha, than yours. And I can see that his was more, you have the body and then you could take it apart, or put tension in it, or somehow surprise it, or do things like that. But that's not the same as kind of enveloping it in a whole different environment of, anyway, this is not an organized answer, so you go ahead now.
Well, I mean, what you said makes me realize, or want to speak to something that's extremely important to me as a sculptor in the studio. I'm very process oriented, and in some ways I have kind of relationships with my materials. So there's a certain kind of animism or object ontology that I'm interested in terms of my relationship with materials, that I sort of know what I might be doing, but I start down a kind of journey with materials that happen to be materials that usually go from a sort of phase change from liquid to solid at some point. And so there's like a collaboration with my materials that then when I bring, a dancer into there's like a bananas sort of triangulation going on between me, the sculptor, or the doctor, working with, trying to listen to or play alongside materials. And then you bring in a live body, classically trained dancer body, who then sets in kind of a foil to that. So then the body then becomes a material, a tool, and a subjectivity alongside me as a material, tool, subjectivity, and the rubber as a material. So in some senses, that idea of doctor having authority over a material for me is washed away. And just sort of psychoanalytically speaking, my mother was an infectious disease physician, and my father is a molecular geneticist. And so from a very early age, I was thinking about your body, pleasure and pain, existing on an extremely small abstract scale, and that those little molecules, those little shapes, actually had their own sort of subjectivity, their own workings inside of you, producing, your experience of the world. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, Brooke, but that's my way through it anyway.
I'm thinking that, do we have time do you want to go to questions now, Claire, and then
Yeah, I would love to. So just to the audience, if you have if you have any questions or thoughts, or you want to go back and look at something together, that's great. And I will be sort of moderating that. So I'm going to give him the questions in a minute to populate. And I would just ask Jennifer, to begin sort of, what do we know, if anything, about Balanchine's understanding of the humors in the ancient sense? Was this something like, how did his process involve sort of research and bringing those things to bear? How did he sort of navigate those things in his own process?
So I think he worked actually much more the way Martha is describing, in the sense that he was somebody who read an enormous amount, who knew an enormous amount, but he also erased his own presence. He left very little of his, he wrote very little. We don't really know. He didn't sit down and talk to the dancers and say, we're going to work on the 4 humors, and you're going to be phlegmatic, and you're going to be, no, he just walked into the studio, like you were saying, like a bunch of people in complicated tools, because the whole psychological beings themselves, with a body and the insides and the outsides and everything, and then his main preparation had to do with the music, and really, really studying and understanding the music. And so the music, I think, was the key in, which is not to say that he didn't know any. You look at the ballet and you know that he was thinking about the humors. And for example, the one thing that he told one of the dancers was that the phlegmatic dancer, and I wonder, Martha, how this will strike you. He said to him, it takes so much to break out of lethargy. It takes a massive amount of inner strength. And maybe that's, I don't know, Brooke, I mean, is that like getting rid of the fluids, or is it inviting them in? I don't know, but you have to find that inner strength, something to break out of it, and then you will naturally retreat back into it. And so it's not really an answer to your question, but the ways in which he got to the choreography was really, I think, with the music, and then in the studio with the dancers saying, do this, something like, and then they would do something else, or the same, or it would be a kind of fluid, organic process between them.
It's interesting
because he knew exactly what he wanted and he just said, do this. Yeah, go ahead, Martha. Yeah.
It's interesting when Silas and I were trying to figure out what exactly he was going to do inside the phlegmatic costume, which is basically a bodice that I poured sort of light blue, gray blue rubber across, and then attached these like cast rubber tubes that go up to this, rubber curtain. Getting in and out of that particular costume was by far the hardest, because he basically laid down on the floor and in front of everyone. Part of the piece was he would do all the dances in the round and get in and out of each costume as he made his way around the room. And so like getting into the phlegmatic costume, it took him a long time. He had to sort of wiggle into it and pull it across and up and then pull it, and and then we just basically decided it's going to take him then in the dance a long time to get up, like getting up. And then he had this big rubber block that was tied to one of his feet as sort of a shoe that set him off balance. So just getting him vertical was going to be basically all of it. And then he was going to do a sort of thing and fall back down. So yeah, just in terms of making that choreography, those movements really came out of the difficulty getting in and out of this rubber tight, shirt, really, or yeah.
Yeah, and Balanchine, sometimes when Brooke, you asked me how it was to dance it. I mean, my memory of it is that you felt like almost like you were getting in and out of your own body. You'd have to kind of like, there were these strange movements that made you almost crawl around and skitter around and in and out of your own skin in a very different way from, just aesthetically from what you're talking about, but maybe not so different in terms of some of the character of it.
And there's sort of there's so many great questions in the chat. There's sort of a cluster of questions that I'm going to try to kind of bring into one. So the one question is sort of, which I think you touched on a little bit, is the idea of using the four temperaments comes maybe not initially from Balanchine, but from Hindemith. Is that? And so that was one of the questions. And then the other is, are there other ballets besides the four temperaments which involve humors? And then do we know about Hindemith's engagement with classical antiquity and how it fits into that collaboration? So that's like a big three-parter question, but I felt like there was a group of them sort of gathering together there.
I don't know, Martha, do you want to take that and talk something about your interest in Hindemith? Because
well, when Silas, I think Silas thought I knew more about it than I actually did, and so then he left, and I ran over and started watching all that I could. I was super interested in the music, and so I started taking apart the Hindemith and pulling phrases from it, and then repeating certain phrases that felt like they described the temperaments, like something that felt, whether or not it was in the actual part of the Balanchine, that it was, whether or not the part was the melancholic part. If it sounded melancholic to me, I would grab it and use it and repeat it. So, and then I would play that for Silas, and then he might remember a movement, and then I would drape the rubber over him. So the Hindemith did in some ways sort of like help us orient ourselves within the temperaments. So I mean, I just sort of collaged it, but it was an entry point for me to understand the Balanchine ballet. Yeah.
Wonderful. There's so much here. Okay. I'm gonna just pick up one other question that we have in the chat here. It says, Jennifer mentioned how in the melancholic section, one sees the body broken, made into parts with the classical technique draining away. Are there different ways of breaking down that can be distinguished in the four sections, that might be ways of visualizing differences in the forms of breakdown that the dominance or isolation of each specific humor might represent?
So, that's such a hard question to answer without the actual dance in front of you. And I mean, I would just say, go watch it. And we've got the link to a good production, a New York City Ballet production that you can watch online. And there's certainly, they have the characters that Brooke was describing, and the dances, choleric is sort of, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that choleric and sanguinic are both women and led by women, and melancholic and phlegmatic are led by men. So he's kind of given that a certain gendered feel to it. I understand what the question is. Just is there some way in which the breakdown characterizes the humor? Is that's sort of what I'm understanding? And it's a good question. I think there probably is, but I don't know it right off the top of my head. I'd have to go study it. So I think it's a good question.
I mean, can I just say, there's something that I find really interesting about this question, which is there's this something that became clear when we think about the four temperaments versus Galen's notion of sort of euchrasia, which comes back in maybe in the classical form, is the idea that there's all these different ways of we might characterize as pathology, but they also generate their own norms. And those norms could be seen as rebellions against a kind of model of perfect articulation, which approaches disembodiment at some level, and challenges that in a way. And I think there's something really interesting in that, in the idea of the four temperaments, or this, the question that Kristen asked, which is like, are there different ways of being that get coded as pathological because they're affective, because they're about determinism of fluids or about determinism of nature, that can then be picked up as sites of resistance to forms of normative embodiment, which refuse the body and also insist that otherness or difference is always pathological. And so there's a really interesting question, I think, that the humors start to open up around what it means to be determined by the body, to think of who we are as embodied natures through difference, but then also through technique or art or, obviously medicine is implicated in complicated ways, what it means to also manipulate that. And so it was just making me think of, like Claire's great book, The Disability Studies, Queer Theorist, called Brilliant Imperfection, around this like really difficult space of like, what's a technical intervention that is aesthetic or about flourishing, and which one is the determination of a state of being as pathological that has to be corrected vis-a-vis a norm. And I think that space is really interesting. I don't know, the question just made me think about the Temperaments as a site for exploring these other ways of being, right? As not only pathological, but also pathological as a site of resistance.
So in a way, they have a kind of contemporary relevance, even though we think, oh, well, scientifically, we know otherwise now. We know there's not that, but do we, I mean, in some ways, the idea of the temperament is a very mysterious one. And we're still kind of, I think, right, mystified by that. I mean, I don't know. How do you think about, Brooke, especially the temperaments today? I mean, do you think of character in those terms, or temperament, or?
I mean, and I should clarify, because I think you like Claire, is also a trans theorist. So there's also, I think, a lot of interesting work in trans theory and queer theory around embodiment and norms. And it's not so much the temperaments themselves, maybe, that it's the questions, the kind of philosophical questions that they open up around, a nature as given, the feeling of the body, affect as who you are and what that means, and also the ways in which medicine and the medical establishment can be both an ally in the sense of able to sort of make technical interventions in the body, but also impose a normative body that is, or to pathologize conditions in ways that have been, incredibly detrimental. So I think that's where I see the kind of, resonances, I mean, there's other ways you could, we were talking a little bit about the humoral body is often about the body turning on yourself and what that means, and to be betrayed from within, which I think opens on to questions around cancer and the imagination around cancer and the contemporary imagination, which may not seem like humoral, but is a model which isn't, humoral theory is often opposed to contagion theory. Like, one reason we think there's not a lot of contagion theory in antiquity is because they're much more invested in the body's own participation in its pathologies, right? And so today, when we think about cancer vis-a-vis, I mean, Susan Sontag's famous work, but you even think about, the pandemic, like, what does it mean for the body to turn on itself? And even within the pandemic, the notion of pre-existing conditions gets folded into that. So I think those are the kinds of philosophical sites that these questions sort of activate today.
I think we maybe have time for one more question, or maybe two. One person asks, and Brooke, this might relate to you, but obviously extends to the other panelists as well, is has research been done on the relationships of humoral theory to Eastern medical theories like Ayurveda or Chinese medicine? And then, was Balanchine interested in any of those ideas?
And it's a great question. I want to, because we're short on time, I'm going to, maybe Jennifer, if you want to start that, I'm going to put a link to an open access book, which is a really great book called Fluid Matters, which was done with pre-modern specialists in pre-modern medicine, looking at how a shared kind of imagination of the fluids in both early Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, and there's a lot of uncertainty around points of contact between those traditions. I mean, when you get into the more modern period, Chigahisa Kuriyama has worked on humoralism, moving into, say, Japan. So there's both contact, and then there's kind of polygenesis, and it's just a great resource. So I'm going to put that in, and Jennifer, I don't know if you want to pick up with Balanchine.
I can just say that Balanchine, I don't know of any specific interest in that, but he was certainly had a sort of mystical inclinations, and was interested in what he would have maybe put at the time as like science. He was interested in all kinds of things. He was interested in objects from outer space, in scientific theory, in physics, and he read all kinds of things like that. And then he had this mystical theosophical event as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some kind of way in through those various readings that he was constantly engaged in.
And thank you so much for adding that resource and for that answer. And then the final question is really is directed toward Martha. And it says, what does it mean to reach back into classical antiquity for this model of the humors, especially in regard to your desire to deconstruct the Cartesian model of existence?
Oh, what does it mean? It means, well, to be crass, it means not elevating the male mind above all else, or to be direct about it. I think maybe in more interesting terms, it means deconstructing some binaries. I mean, I think of a lot of what Brooke was just saying, the sort of binaries between between male and female, a normative, a non-normative body, between hard and soft, between inside and outside, between fluid and static, that like that reaching, like when I think of classical antiquity in terms of a sculptor, I think of marble, and rubber is very, very different from marble. You know, it's extremely unlike marble, and it's pliable, it's malleable, it does live between liquid and solid, it responds to its container. And to me, those are feminist ideas. That's a feminist position to take in relationship to a kind of classical antiquity. And so for me, it's about it's about rethinking the power structures of what it means to be, the male, I think, therefore I am mind.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much for this, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us today and for your extremely thoughtful questions, which really extended the conversation. I know we could all continue this, and we'll look forward to seeing more of the work of our three panelists. So I just want to thank them all for their wonderful, wonderful presentations. So thank you. And we wish everybody a happy afternoon.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.